So many people are looking to live happier, more stress-free lives. We provide interviews from mental health experts across various fields because we know finding quality information isn't always easy. Let's find more sanity together. Hello and welcome back, everybody, to Sanity Podcast. I have a very special panel today, and I could probably spend a whole episode telling you why each and every single one of these people are amazing to have on the show. But I think I'm going to do things differently this time, and I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves because we have multiple guests. Today's topic is how to use metaphor to aid in therapy, such as pop culture, superheroes, and other themes. And we'll jump into that after the introductions. So Jessica, do you want to start us off with telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist and clinical assistant professor at NYU Langone Health, and I do a whole bunch of different things, including therapy, as well as media and consultation. I work with teams, companies, do research. I'm a co-host on the psychiatry show on Dr. Radio on Sirius XM. I'm an advisor for Wondermind, which is a mental fitness company founded by Selena Gomez and a couple other really talented folks like Mandy Teefey and Daniela Pearson. And then do a whole bunch of just other types of media engagements with journalists and TV hosts and things of this nature. And I love talking about depression, anxiety, ADHD, and just hacking your mind's engine and learning to be the best version of yourself. And I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome on the show. And you should be a natural at this with your experience being on the radio often, right?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, Sandra, how about you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not on the radio often, so we'll see how this goes. I am Sandra Pimentel, also a clinical psychologist. I'm the chief of child and adolescent psychology at Montefiore Medical Center, Albert Einstein College of Medicine. I'm the director of our anxiety and mood program in our youth services, and also co-director of our emerging adult program. So dealing a lot with kids, adolescents, emerging adults, and trying to make cognitive behavioral therapy and therapy in general as fun as possible. As I said, I'm at Montefiore in the Bronx, home of the New York Yankees. I love the Yankees. I love sports in particular, and so I love talking about and how to include whether it's sports or pop culture in general, and the folks that we can reference like Cardi B and Lizzo and some cooler folks than I to enhance reaching out to kids and talking about therapy.
Very
I'm excited
cool.
to be here too.
Well, I'm happy to have you on the show because I'm a sci-fi nerd. I don't watch sports. So I'm Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica. So having the sport perspective should be really amazing. Yes. All right, Jason, we have another Jason, another brother in name. So Jason, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I'm excited to be here. I like doing podcasts with other people named Jason.
Oh, perfect.
That's one of, I guess that's a new side project that I'm working on, seeking out Jasons and talking to them. I practice clinical and sports psychology. I'm in a group practice in Southern California called CBT SoCal, or CBT Center of Southern California. Let's see. I specialize in OCD, insomnia, anxiety, sports psychology. When I'm not working with clinical populations, I'm working with NCAA athletes, doing fun stuff like improv comedy and other team building activities that help them to feel embarrassed, feel performance anxiety, probably even feel cringy, but then focus on their task anyway. So that's a lot of fun for me. It's usually a lot of fun for the athletes. And I also, I love sci-fi. I love Star Trek, Star Wars, lots of different fandoms. And I love going on podcasts and talking about it.
Well, that's absolutely great. Well, thank you for coming on from California. That's awesome. And that's very cool that you're working with those athletes. I did stand-up comedy one time, and it was one of the most terrifying things that I ever did in my life. So I could only imagine how effective doing improv, which is not a rehearsed script, is even more anxiety provoking. So very cool. All right, Kristen, you're up.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me here as well. I'm also a clinical psychologist, and as with Jessica, I'm at NYU Langone Health, and I'm an assistant professor there in the Department of Psychiatry. I primarily do research actually in our anxiety, stress, and prolonged grief program. My main focus of my research is in exercise interventions for people with anxiety and depression. But I also do some clinical work and primarily use cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT and love to integrate metaphors in there in general, and especially pop culture metaphors when I get the chance and have somebody who's welcoming it in my therapy. And I'll say my favorite ones to use are Disney movies. I'm a Disney nerd and have been every princess for Halloween, probably starting at age 1 until currently age 35. And I love all TV and movies. A lot of trashy reality TV, but I try to keep that out of the therapy room unless they really want it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like trashy reality TV could be great. I talk about The Bachelor in therapy, so
Oh yeah,
I'm with you on trashy reality
TV.
Yeah. We could do another episode just talking about The Bachelor. It will be nothing about psychology, just us and The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. Don't forget The Bachelorette and Bachelor in Paradise.
Of course.
Okay, Simon, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks so much for having me and all of us on. And as you know, we've been planning this for quite some time, and I'm so glad we made it work. And I've had the good fortune of talking with all the other panelists at different times about the use of metaphors in therapy. So it's a real treat to be on. I'm chief of psychology here at Montefiore Medical Center and just hit professor of psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. So I'm pleased to break that news on your podcast, although that's nothing to do with it. But
Yes.
I don't think that changes my level of expertise in talking about metaphors, but it's a nice little thing for the CV. I think my fascination with stories and metaphors and analogies comes in the vein of how do you get people to remember the good stuff that we offer in CBT when so little of what we try to teach our patients gets carried session to session and carried forth, and how do we use images or stories or metaphors to drive home some of the points and in the spirit of dissemination and helping people become more efficient at remembering our content. I'm fascinated with how it started with very bread and butter type ideas, and now we've branched into superheroes and pop or pop culture and fiction and all these other variants that really help have patients grab hold of what we're trying to teach. So that's my angle for today. I'm really fascinated with how we can apply our principles and have them be digestible and memorable for our patients that we work with.
Okay, and I think everybody on the panel and myself, congratulations on the achievement, and that's absolutely wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Okay. So one thing I've said on my show before is that therapy doesn't need to be so sterile and so boring, right? It doesn't need to be so serious. It could be fun. And I laugh with my patients, particularly if we're doing like prank calls for social anxiety. At the end of the prank calls, we'll sit there and just laugh at what happened, or dancing on the street corner or something like that. So I love this idea of bringing in fun things into therapy to make it more fun. And Simon, since I've known you the longest, I'll pick on you first, and you guys, jump in when you feel like it's relevant. But how did you even get started with this idea that it's important to bring these type of cultural metaphors in to help therapy improve and be more fun? And how did you all basically get on this kick?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, and I'd like to link it back actually to grad school, where my mentor in grad school was a person named Arnold Lazarus, and he was an early CBT founder and one of the luminaries in the field before he passed away. And his variant on CBT was something called multimodal therapy, or MMT. And one of the dimensions that he was particularly attuned to was an imagery dimension, and part of his model, which was called a basic ID model. So he elaborated on thoughts and feelings and included things like sensations and images in the work that he did. And so in my work with him as a supervisor, he was constantly referring me to early material in the field that used, or it suggested therapists use metaphors with patients to enhance the content of the sessions. So there's early books that link back to the sort of origins of language and how messages were passed along in different communities, on customs and the history of the community that that then capitalized on those elements that you could borrow from and distill to help translate some of our concepts to patients. So it started there. And I've had a fascination for a long time. And then it's, as the literature's emerged and grown over time, I've paid attention to it and tried to collect a little folder of articles that I review from time to time. And as I've talked with colleagues, we started to share stories and examples with one another. Now, as you know, there's books published on the topic, and you have at your fingertips a whole series of books that allow you to pick and choose depending on where you are with different patients and different concepts to use in the sessions and try them out.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I've always thought about how like the spoken story was one of our very first teaching models. Before we wrote anything down, we told stories and we passed it on. And I never connected two and two together with why this might be a great idea. Well, like, yeah, no duh. Like human beings learn from stories that we tell each other. So why not metaphors and pop culture in order to do that? How about anybody else say, like Jessica, how did you get into the idea of using metaphor in therapy?
So I think I've always been interested in finding ways to make therapeutic concepts more relatable and to connect with people that I have in the therapy room. I think when it comes specifically to metaphors, I actually have to give a huge shout out to Kristen here, because she, a number of years ago when we were postdocs together, she gave a killer talk about metaphors and how to use them in the therapeutic environment. And she really gets a lot of credit in this. And so, Kristen, thank you. But I think what's really cool about we were postdocs together, so we have a long history of learning together in terms of things that we do in the therapeutic space. So it's pretty cool. I think what's so neat about it is that it allows us, of course, to connect with the patients, the clients that we have in the therapeutic space, and to show them that we are human, and to take what can potentially be abstract concepts and make them a little bit more digestible and something that we can connect with on a level that feels more approachable. And I think that's really important when we're dealing with medical conditions, chronic mental illness, and just stress and the complexities of life, and being able to see things outside of ourselves, I think is really powerful, and metaphors serve in that way. And something that I talk about a lot is, boundaries obviously exist in the therapeutic relationship, and they're there for a reason, in order to protect the space and to protect our clients and our patients. But what that sometimes means is that we need to be creative in finding ways to connect with the people that we're doing therapy with, so that way we can show them that we align with them and that we understand their experience and that we are humans walking in the same world together. And I think using metaphors, particularly in pop culture or sports or things of this nature, is a great way to do that, because we can connect in those human ways, in ways that still protect the boundaries of the therapeutic relationship and the integrity of that space. And so I think it's a cool way to make it fun, make it light. I think a lot of my patients would would agree that I like to use humor and sarcasm in ways that are, of course, appropriate for whatever it is that we're talking about. But sometimes it takes these weighty topics and just makes them easier for us to talk about and to connect and to get past hurdles that are really challenging sometimes in making progress. And again, like using these metaphors and all of these references and things of this nature really allow us to utilize some of those basic human tools. And for someone like myself, again, who likes humor and sarcasm and things like that, it's fun. It just makes it fun.
Well, Kristen, how do you feel that you changed Jessica's whole life trajectory with one?
Well, I'm always here to try to get people to watch more TV and movies. So I think I'm happy to say that I've done that for not only Jessica, but maybe many of her patients.
Oh, without question.
I mean, I think that it's something, it's obviously useful in therapy. I think it's also something that, as therapists, it's nice to be able to kind of like connect to people, show our human side, as Jessica said. And also, for me, it's a big self-care activity. It's like a huge part of my life behind the scenes as a therapist. So it's a fun way to bring that into my professional space too, which was part of the reason we got this panel together, because I was like, I like this stuff and I want to bring it to a conference too. But I think, not only is it kind of relatable. I think, what we could also do is take what the patients give us too, because oftentimes when we're talking with our patients or just in that chit chat as we're walking to the therapy room, which is kind of no longer a thing, but maybe as we're catching up on the week on our virtual sessions, that sometimes they'll mention something, and oftentimes in my sessions, it ends up being something pop culture related. And you can take that and run with it. And that's, I think, the best use of metaphors is something that a patient brings in, because then it's going to be relatable to them. You can always try to bring one up, but I think it's important not to force it too, because if they haven't seen the movie or TV show or don't like it, then you're violating kind of the main purpose of using metaphors in the first place, which is, being able to relate to them and have them remember it and have it sink in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Sandra, what got you on the metaphor train?
Yeah, it's I think related to a lot of what people have said already. I'm a kid person, and so I think you have to be able to describe CBT concepts and constructs, whether you're talking to a 25-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 5-year-old, and kids rarely self-refer for treatment, right? So we're always looking for that hook to get them to. I mean, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in New York City, right? That they're going to refer themselves for treatment, and so trying to find that hook and that connection. And sometimes it's as straightforward as they like Spider-Man, and so you give them a Spider-Man sticker to reinforce or part of their behavior plan. And other times it's, superhero analogies and trying to find ways that will inspire them to understand some of the constructs that we're trying to teach. I think that's part of the answer that comes to mind. I remember a patient of mine in graduate school. I was not a reality TV watcher, and she loved Survivor. Whenever the first year of Survivor was, and she loved Elizabeth, who's now Elizabeth Hasselbeck or whatever. And so I was like, she keeps talking about this Elizabeth person. So I started watching it to try to connect with this patient. She's probably in her 30s now, which I don't want to think about, whatever. And so sometimes it's like the intentional stuff that we do to try to create that hook. And sometimes it's, I think, the incidental, the stuff that we already do, whether it's TV shows we already watch or Yankees or things that I'll talk about at any point. And so, I think much like everyone else, trying to make it fun, creative, and trying to get that hook in, especially with kids and emerging adults.
Yeah. So how much Paw Patrol do you watch now?
Depends on the kid, right? It's true. I know. Simon, your son used to love Paw Patrol, right?
We've done. It's funny how when you have kids too, you use the metaphors for them, but they also drive the content depending on what's trending right now. So it's all cocoa melons for me right now.
It's cocoa melons. well, Simon.
But even in those stories, even in the show, there's some of the little songs they do have stories you could use, like when the girl's trying to learn how to skip rope.
So Simon, who's your favorite pup out of Sky Patrol?
Paw Patrol.
Yeah, sorry.
My son used to have a leaning towards Sky.
Yeah.
So
every kid has a leaning towards Sky, I feel like. Sky, and who's the other one that's very popular? He's like the police officer.
There's Chase, there's Rubble.
Chase and Sky seem very popular.
You can tell we're adult people because I'm just like, I have no idea.
You're like, who are these people?
You go where you must,
Okay, Jason, and how did you get working with metaphor?
Yeah, listening to other people talk, I think those stories are great and very interesting. And I almost wish that I was coming from the perspective of, wanting to be a great therapist and having a master plan and, using all the tools that are needed and all that stuff. And I kind of am in a sense, but really I'm more of a movie fan and a TV fan. And then I ended up being a psychologist. So initially, I just really enjoyed, of course, watching like Game of Thrones and lots of great movies and Star Trek and Star Wars and all that stuff. And when Game of Thrones was very popular, I just loved thinking about the characters and understanding them and understanding their motivation and kind of trying to predict what's going to happen next in the show. And I thought, man, it would be really cool to go on a podcast and talk about stuff like this, and maybe other great movies and TV shows too. And then I ended up going on a podcast with some colleagues. It's called Psych Rally, and we did an episode right before the final season of Game of Thrones was going to come out. And at that time, we didn't know what was coming for us, and we were very excited. And we had all these great predictions, and we were really looking forward to it. And we talked about the different characters, conceptualizing them based on CBT, and talking about how we would, work with them, and then making predictions for the show and stuff. And then the season came out, and that's a different story. But it was a lot of fun, doing that episode and thinking about the characters, and we got feedback from other therapists who said they listened to it and they really enjoyed it, and they started talking about the metaphors in therapy with their own clients. And then that kind of woke me up a little bit more, because I work with adults, and at times it would just naturally turn into, talking about, Jedi or whatever it might be. And my clients would get really excited. And at that time, I would feel a little awkward, because I didn't want them to leave session and then think, I paid all this money and then we talked about Star Wars. So I was a little hesitant. So I was a little hesitant to do it too much, but over time I've gotten more comfortable with it, and I've used it much more as a metaphor and kind of draw from my clients what they've learned from these characters, what it is that they admire about them, how would this character handle some of the situations that they find themselves in. And it has been a big source of help for clients who can look at those strengths and then see that they also have those strengths, and see that they can also use them in their daily lives. And it's not just in fantasy or in TV where someone can face their fear, or do something based on their values and kind of save the day. You can also do that in everyday activities in your own personal life.
And one thing I'm sort of getting is that it's not just metaphor. There's also power in role modeling with healthy characters, or I don't know, the opposite, anti-role modeling, like characters you shouldn't be like. Maybe there's a word for that I can't think of. So there's also an activist component of it and learning from these characters.
Yeah, I would say I had one memory of one patient who was a big fan of This Is Us, as am I. Cry every episode. So sad it's gone. But she came in one time and said, "Oh my God, I now understand what I'm like when I'm anxious to my boyfriend, because I saw Randall do it. And now I understand why that is so distressing for him to see when I'm feeling that way." And it was just a whole discussion about kind of that revelation of being able to see it play out from an outside perspective.
And I think that beautifully leads me into my next phase of questioning here, is because you could do therapy and you could just be straight on with the person's issue that they're coming in with the real factors that are going on in their life and the real people, and staying within their world, right? What is the added utility of pulling out of them and going into the metaphor? Like, why even do this? What is the added benefit rather than just staying in their reality? And I'll leave that open to anybody to jump in.
Well, a lot of times people will have their favorite genres or favorite fandoms, and it can mean a lot to them. And sometimes people can be a little bit embarrassed by it and not really talk about it too openly, and you need to kind of build rapport and then draw it out of them. And then sometimes people are very very open about it, and they write fan fiction, and they watch the movie or their favorite TV show after a long hard day of work, on a regular basis, and it's very comforting to them. So these are things that can mean a lot to people, and and can evoke strong emotion, and the characters can really live with them in their mind. So it's just like an instant connection where the person will immediately understand the metaphor, and it could immediately mean a lot to them if you're drawing it from them. And it's, and if they do, 'cause people don't always have some kind of favorite symbolism or metaphor, but oftentimes they do, and it just makes your job a lot easier and means more to them.
Yeah. I would say also you can start to use it as shorthand later on, because instead of saying, something like, oh, remember that time we talked about cognitive restructuring? And then nobody remembers what that means, then you can bring up, a certain character and like, what would Jon Snow do here? Or something like that, whatever you had used to illustrate that concept. And it just becomes something that's kind of an instant, oh yeah, I should be using this practice in this moment.
And this is true for adults, but Sandra, I'm thinking about children. Is there the idea that it makes it a safer experience to interact with the emotions? Because maybe we're not talking about them directly experiencing it, but rather those people experiencing it. So there could be some pre-processing for the behavioral folks, like an exposure to the emotion first before jumping into it themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things we do, for example, when we're working with kids who have OCD is or their anxiety, we teach them to externalize it, name it, call it something outside of themselves, or when we're teaching them to, identify their automatic thoughts or their negative automatic thoughts, how to challenge them, or what would you tell a friend to do in that situation? So we use, externalizing as a skill all the time. And if you can do it for a relevant, readily available, someone or some character that's accessible to them, all the better. There are pop culture references all around that can, that you can draw kids into for sure.
I had a kid do that once where I said, draw a monster, but unfortunately that movie Monsters, Inc. had just come out. And so those were like fun, friendly monsters. And so it did not turn out the way that it was supposed to work. Because they're like, but I like the monster. I don't want to get rid of the OCD monster. And I was like, I got to figure my way around that though. Yeah. So it can backfire, but just like everything else could backfire. But that was one funny story that I had.
I think, Jason, I think too, there's a lot of flexibility in metaphors. And so you could, like, to me, what you just said, I would probably think I'd spin that into, well, if this monster from Monster Inc. is friendly, how do we take your OCD monster and make him more like how does he get to join in with the guys and girls from Monsters Inc.? How do we make him part of that team, so to speak? And you can move, the beauty of it, I think, to me, is you can move around them a lot, even if you have just a basic, it's a bit like improv, I guess, or you have a basic story, and then you have a lot of ways that you can wiggle around depending on which one you're using and who the person in the room is. So a framework is there, but there's a million ways you can go. So to me, there's not really a wrong answer with them. You can, as long as you're sort of quick, it challenges you to be a little quick on your feet and think, okay, well, how do I turn it in a way that I wasn't expecting? But there's often a lot of richness in them that you can really sort of shape them depending on what your goal and mission is, even if it's a standard metaphor like introducing cognitive restructuring or a character from a movie or from a television show or in somewhere in pop culture. That's what I love about it. It encourages the therapist to also be a little bit nimble and think, how do I take this and turn it for this person who it didn't go this way, but how do I turn it into that way?
Where were you 6 years ago when I needed you? That could have been so useful.
It's easy to say on the podcast. Now put me in the room and see how I feel.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I love that Judy Beck always says is that she says, I hope I'm a better therapist 5 years than I am today. And I hope I'm a better therapist than I was 5 years ago. And I hope I'm a better therapist in 5 years today, because we're always learning. Does anybody else have thought about using pop culture and metaphor as being a safer place for people to go into as maybe a starting point or an example of how you used it for that?
I would agree with that for sure. I think what can sometimes happen is that people have a hard time naming their experience, especially if it feels like a dangerous one. So for instance, in experience of trauma, let's say, it can feel really difficult, obviously, to approach that experience and those emotions associated with it. And if you can use a film, TV, whatever it might be, then it allows that patient to see sort of from outside of themselves. You know, we're talking here a lot about externalizing. It sort of reminds me a lot of diffusion from acceptance and commitment therapy. And what I think is really helpful is it kind of serves as like a little bit of a mirror for people. Kristen and I have talked about this like 1,000 times. I dare you guys to count how many times I talk about Encanto on this podcast episode. Encanto was this beautiful film that I think did a lot of people, especially for groups of people that are typically not well represented in pop culture. And I had a couple of people, particularly people of color with intergenerational trauma, say, holy cow, I saw myself in a character and I saw things in myself I would have never been able to notice. I saw myself in Mirabelle or Louisa or whoever. And it gave them that sense of reflection, really, to be able to take a glance at those types of things that they couldn't name and that they couldn't necessarily identify and that felt dangerous. And if they can see it from outside of themselves, then they can start to develop the language that they might need to be able to describe their experience, and then ever so slowly, or maybe not so slowly, approach that content, approach that topic, and start to name those emotions for themselves. And I think that can be really powerful.
So I'm just spitballing here because this is the most that I've been thinking about metaphor in a while. But I was also just thinking in my head, maybe using these metaphors to also get to bring people to a more extreme place on a concept than what we could do in the real world. Right? Because this is a fictional thing and something terrible happens, like a whole planet blows up. And Earth hasn't blown up, and fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But what does it feel like to lose your whole home planet, and what might that feel like? And I'm thinking about Spock in the new Star Trek movie. His whole planet got blown up, so it allows us to maybe interact with concepts in a much more extreme way for us to make more sense of it and process it in a different way. Do you guys find it operating like that in the work that you might be doing? And I know, Jason, you said that you were a sci-fi guy, so maybe you find that happening in your work more often?
I think that's a great point. I'm not sure if I have, but now I'm thinking about it, and for a while there, Walking Dead was really popular.
Great example.
It was a fun thing to gather around the water cooler and talk about how like you would come up with a strategy if there was a zombie outbreak, and where would you go, who would you team up with, what would your favorite weapon be, and or during Game of Thrones, like what moves would you be making. So I think in everyday life, that is something really interesting to think about. And I even read an article that during the beginning of the pandemic, people were there was a big rise in either Walking Dead or just regular horror movies, and that was a way for people to cope. So I think people are doing that, and then now I'm thinking about it more and thinking that's definitely something to tap into. But so far I haven't, but that's a great idea, and I want to start doing that now.
Well, I know with The Walking Dead, for me, I used to watch it before the pandemic, but I remember it got me thinking a lot about, like, what is the meaning of life? Like, what's the point? So if I was in this situation where I was being constantly people trying to eat me, and then the other humans are always trying to kill me, and I'm like, would I want to have children in that type of world? What would make me happy? Could I possibly be happy? And I'm glad you brought up that example, because I reflected about myself through watching The Walking Dead.
I think it brings up I was going to say, I think it brings up a good point about just like values. Like, I'm thinking in like a behavioral activation or ACT sort of framework of like, strip away all the luxuries of the world. Like, what is it that you truly value in life, and how do you make that happen even in the midst of like chaos going on? And I think, being now in a global pandemic for over 2 years, there's been a lot of chaos and extra burden of stress, and, trying to figure out, how do we walk in this world that is throwing us curveballs every day, and trying to kind of manage in that and still be able to get value out of what we're doing. And maybe some of these more apocalyptic type of TV shows or movies can help us think about it in a different way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why superheroes are so appealing, right? Because I mean, they all have an origin story, and they've seen some stuff, right? And it's usually born in adversity of some, often horrible magnitude, and I think that's so applicable. And if we think about, resilience and sort of part of the story that we try to teach often, and especially, I mean, from my lens, kids, right? It's what are the ingredients of resilience? Is sort of how do we learn how to cope with the adversity, and we've had adversity in spades, and that model. So when and thing the nice part about superheroes, I think now, is that they're everywhere, right? It's TV shows, it's movies, it's cartoons, it's clothes, and it's so readily available from a very young age. There are the kids who don't take off their Spider-Man costumes, or jammies or what have you. And I think it offers us a nice way to talk about these bigger topics: trauma, adversity, pandemics. I don't know about zombies, but maybe. I mean, locusts. So what's coming next? And think about how the process by which we adapt, to that, which is I think part of the definition of resilience.
Simon, I saw you rearing up to say something. So what was on your mind?
I mean, I agree with Sandy's point. Mine was much more concrete. I was going to say, if you have a patient identifying with Negan who has a bat named Lucille, it's going to tell you a lot of stuff right away that will probably be helpful in therapy and in reporting. And so you can use it on a concrete level too. But I love the idea, like even in Walking Dead or even in Game of Thrones, like I imagine like the Battle of the Bastards scene where you've got a person standing up, looking at an army of people coming towards them, and it sends them. You can identify moments in all of these, even apocalyptic films, when people take a stand and people show courage, and even if back to what Jess was saying, even if the outcome doesn't always end up joyous, you can still demonstrate qualities or highlight qualities in characters that for kids or adults they can grab onto and give themselves hope. An example I was going to use is, it's dated now. You have to also be careful with some of these because it changes so fast. But I love to use the George Costanza from Seinfeld and the episode where he acts opposite to all of his instincts.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of exposure. Yeah. Your instincts, your whole life have told you to go this way, and look where it's gotten you. So what would happen if just you decide on a dime to say, here's how I'm going to do things today? And in that episode, which is a classic in the Seinfeld series, is all these good things start to happen when he goes against his impulses. And you can use those examples of characters, even if they're flawed, and is usually an episode where even flawed characters and shows have a success. And so I love that idea of finding, as Sandy said, resiliency and lessons of coping that almost everyone can find in a character.
Talk about feeling dated. I did a training a couple of days ago for our incoming interns and externs. And I have a slide, and I keep this slide to remind me of my age primarily. And it made a Who's the Boss Tony Danza reference. And this was the first year that not a one knew the reference. And I was referencing, I know who, in terms of when we do parent-child intakes as part of the ADIS semi-structured, like who's the boss? And so I thought that was very clever. And nothing. I got nothing from them. So this was the year that Who's the Boss is no longer relevant.
I mentioned Fraggle Rock the other day.
Bueller. I made a Bueller comment and no one got it. I was like, guys, get on it.
So Who's the Boss, Ferris Bueller, Fraggle Rock. Did anybody else watch Fraggle Rock? Was I the only one? I love Fraggle Rock. Nobody knows Fraggle Rock anymore. But they always had something interesting to teach you. I watched it as an adult and I was like, wow, I must have learned a lot from these people. A comment that a few of you guys said was values, and somebody might have said morals, and I'm going to throw in the word ethics. And I'm going to bring up a Star Trek I told you I'm a sci-fi guy. Star Trek The Next Generation episode. There was a planet where they went to, and when somebody, I think it was above the age of 65, they would go into a room and they would very painlessly self-terminate in order to reduce the burden of the economic cost of having to care for the elderly. And so I think Star Trek really put to the front, right? That was an extreme metaphor there, right? About how do we consider the elderly in our society? How do we care for them? What is the value and what does that mean? So how much do you find that stuck with me? I remember watching that. I think I was in high school when I watched that episode, and I remember it was just such an eye-opening episode for me, and it still stuck with me. And this is the first time I thought about it in a while. How much do you guys find yourself using the moral quandaries in these things, whether it be trashy reality TV? Well, let's not put trashy on it. I don't want to be judgmental. No judgment, Joe. Safe space. Reality TV, sci-fi, comedy, even what people in sports are doing, using examples from pop culture and all that to help people reflect, to realize what they think about it and what lessons that they can learn.
It's so interesting you say that, because a couple years ago I did an exercise with someone and I said, can you write a little sort of short statement, essay type thing about what kind of person you want to be in your life? And this person said Don Draper. And I found that very interesting. And that was a really interesting way for us to explore the complexities of Don Draper and what it was that appealed to this person about Don Draper. And it's, I think, sometimes interesting when people do connect with characters that maybe culture, film, TV paint in flawed ways or nuanced ways or complex ways, and to get a sense of what those values are, back to values, and to explore some of those pieces that might be of interest to the person or aligned or maybe misaligned, or maybe are conflicts in that individual, and to be able to unpack those conflicts and sort of explore from there. And I think that, that is a really fascinating thing to do. I think a much more serious version of this, in which I found people finding ways to talk about ethics and morals and things like that. Obviously, this is heavy given everything that's happening right now, is to think about The Handmaid's Tale. And I've had a lot of people use that as an avenue to talk about their frustration with what's happening in society and their fears for the future and things like that. And so people, I think, being able to see things on their screens and connect with it, and sometimes connect with it in a bad way, right, with this sense of intense fear and worry and things of this nature, gives people a little bit of language, again, back to that idea of new language, to explain or explore the nuances of the moral dilemmas that they're experiencing or that they're witnessing. And that can be tough. I not as much anymore, but I used to do a ton of work with military veterans, and me and my veterans, depending on who it was and what era they were, I would, watch a lot of war films with them and use that to explore things like moral injury and obviously trauma and things like that, and combat trauma. And it was really fascinating to see people explore what their experiences were as they're watching thing like Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now or those types of things, and to explore the difficulties that they experienced in the world in terms of a moral or ethical dilemma that they feel complicated about, shall we say. So I think there's a lot of room for it.
So I have
sorry, Jason, go ahead.
gone on podcasts and talked about things like that. A few years ago, I went on a podcast related to Star Trek. It's called Strange New Worlds. They have scientists and other researchers on the podcast talking about the science behind the things that you see on that show. And I was there to talk about psychology and sports psychology. And I apologize to people who have never seen Star Trek, but I was talking about Captain Picard and his experience with something called the Borg, these kind of zombie type aliens that assimilate other life forms, just take them over and steal their individuality and force them into a hive mind and take away their free will and that kind of thing. And I was talking about how Picard was assimilated, and then he regained his freedom, and was going through this process of dealing with that trauma of just completely losing himself and losing any individuality that he had, and any ability to make his own decisions or take his own actions. And this was the backdrop of a movie, a Star Trek movie called First Contact, where he had all of this trauma and then needed to face that enemy again. And that can be very similar to what athletes go through sometimes, where in an ideal situation you would be in a very safe environment, and you would play a game, and you would have referees that were fair, and everybody would respect each other and just enjoy the game. But in reality, athletes are often oppressed outside of that game. Maybe they're devalued by society because they are part of a marginalized community. Maybe it's wartime, and then they're representing their country or their community, even though a war is going on. Or maybe they come from a low income neighborhood and are struggling in that way, and then need to put all of that to the side and then compete in their sport. So this is just to say that athletes often deal with trauma and other mental health issues, and then need to be able to cope with that, put that to the side, and focus on their task anyway. And I was using what happened in the Star Trek TV show and movies to illustrate that. So that I would love to do that more in therapy, but I enjoy going on podcasts and doing that, and I think that's great for people learning who are just listening to it. And then I've also gone on Clubhouse. That's kind of a similar situation to going on a podcast, and then talked about things like that. And it does seem to really illustrate the point for people, and they can draw connections between TV or movies and these real life occurrences.
So we've been spending a lot of time talking about the positives that pop culture and sci-fi and the stuff could give us, but sometimes people get the wrong lessons from learning things, or bad lessons, right? It was what was taught, but it wasn't particularly helpful. How do we help people get the correct lessons? And I'm thinking about Don Draper's what triggered this in my head about, how do we help people get the right lessons? And when we talk about things, prevent them from jumping into spaces that might not be so healthy that they get from these shows.
I think with this, it's really just important to have a really open conversation and use the metaphors as a conversation starter, and to be able to kind of talk about these things as being imperfect too. They're not created by us. They're created elsewhere. And so they're not always going to exactly fit what we want them to look like. I think one that comes to mind for me is, I think, a really powerful but also imperfect metaphor from WandaVision. I do a lot of work in grief, and it's not also something that I think a lot of people are aware that prolonged grief can actually be a mental health condition. It has come to the DSM-5 TR, so it is in there now. But there's a scene where Vision says to Wanda, "But what is grief if not love persevering?" And really what we're seeing in what Wanda is doing is a lot of similar symptoms that we might see, of somebody in prolonged grief disorder. However, you can also interpret this in a negative way too, right? Because we're seeing her in some ways being a villain, right? She's controlling the minds of all these people in the city, and that's not a perfect way to kind of interact with your grief. So I think it's really important to kind of highlight the pieces that fit and talk through those, but also acknowledge the pieces that don't, and talk about that too. Because I do think a lot of people with their grief too will also feel this. Will feel like they're a burden to people around them, or they're doing something incorrectly. So even though things don't appear to be kind of maybe the best, so to speak, in quotes, metaphor, it can be a good conversation starter, and in a way to really hone in on important and sometimes challenging concepts.
I think too, what can be really cool is you can use it in a process or meta way. So if you deliver a metaphor that didn't land the way that you wanted it to, or it was interpreted in a way that you think might actually be more harmful to the conversation that you're having, it can actually be a great opportunity to explore cognitive flexibility around the use of that metaphor and to model it. And you, as the therapist, can actually either explicitly or implicitly show that there's a way to change the way that you describe the metaphor or use the metaphor, and also use that as an opportunity to help your patient explore their own cognitive flexibility around the metaphor. So it can actually wind up being this very meta process that can be really cool and demonstrating cognitive flexibility.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing to bringing it back to sports, and that's why I love sports, because really professional sports and sports in general, but professional sports on display is really about failure. So here are people getting paid a lot of money, many of them heroes to many, some great athletes, maybe less great off the field, and sort of using sort of the story of the athlete as well as their performance. So if we think about, obviously baseball percentages, baseball tends to be my go-to along with basketball and some others, but I think it applies across the board where we look at, the story behind someone performing well and what they get paid for and how often they actually fail. The famous quote of Michael Jordan, I have it framed behind me, given to me by a trainee because it speaks so well to how many times he succeeded relative to his failure, and he failed way more than he succeeded. And that's one thing. The other construct, I love the construct of the productive out in baseball. So there are times that you go up to bat and don't get on base, but there's stuff that you can do in order to advance, whether it's your values or whether it's a goal that you can, or something that's your team. And I find that a lot of these constructs can be applied sort of in the same way of that cognitive flexibility. It's not this all or none, but there's a way to sort of think about having that productive out or some way of reframing. One of my favorite philosopher of all time is Yogi Berra, and one of his famous quotes. Again, sort of, it's all about reframing. Such a powerful cognitive tool is like, a reporter asked him about being in a slump, and he's like, "Slump? I ain't in no slump. I just ain't hitting." Right. So if that's not brilliant, right? So thinking about how we sort of have these models, and then also thinking about how we can reframe sort of the failures, as it were.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of athletes like Michael Jordan, right? He didn't make his high school basketball team at first. I know something about sports. Yeah. And then, LeBron James practices like crazy. So these people that are really great and they have some pre-innate talent. Like me, I can't jump more than 3 inches off the floor. So my NBA career ended before it started. But it can be used to help role model that hard, like for example, that hard work is also part of succeeding, not just having raw ability may not be enough. Like themes like this. And any of you sports people might have more to say on that than compared to what I could say on that.
I mean, I agree with everything that you said and Sandy said. And if you think about any sport, right, you have hundreds of players and hundreds of support people working with them on the teams, and there's only one winner per year. Everyone else goes into the year knowing they're going to work as hard as they can, put their mind and body through tremendous strain and stress, have a whole off season of trying to get ready, and then they play a season knowing at the end of it there's only going to be one winner. That's committing to process, and outcome is great, but that's showing there's a lot in that for people that to take and to apply in their lives. And how do you measure what success is? How do you measure what winning is about? And there's a lot of lessons to be derived from that concept. And so there's a lot of ways you can play with that as well.
Yeah, and I really agree with everything that's just been said. Going back to baseball, that's another great metaphor. Like, the best hitters might only get on base about 30% of the time. And that can be applied to lots of situations. If somebody has been applying for jobs and they feel like no one is giving them a second thought, that can be very discouraging. But then if you think about maybe some of their favorite athletes, or if they are interested in baseball, you can do every single thing right and then only have success 30% of the time, and you're considered one of the best. And that can really help motivate people to keep grinding away and focusing on the process for whatever their goal is. And then I'll just add that just like Jason, I actually don't watch that much sports, which surprises a lot of people. I love working with athletes. I love being involved with a team, and I'm a washed up has-been athlete now, but I used to love competing, and I'm getting back to being more active. But when it comes to actually, watching a 5-hour event or putting on Star Trek or something like that, I go to Star Trek or to something else. So I'm just letting people know.
An interesting just antidote. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Jimmy Chin. He filmed Free Solo. Did you guys see Free Solo, about the guy who climbs El Capitan with no ropes on?
The scariest
Right.
thing I've ever seen.
Oh, if I had a phobia, it would be in heights, and I saw an IMAX, and my palms were sweating, and I never get sweaty palms. I watched it multiple times. Well, I met him in a small group. He was talking about one of the books that he wrote, and he was talking about how it was anxiety provoking putting the book together and this, that, and the other. And I rose my hand and I said, yeah, I can imagine being terrifying putting all your failures in a book. Like, how did you handle that? And he kind of looked at me like I was odd. And he's like, well, I'm a mountain climber. Like, I'm a rock climber. We fail by nature. Like I brought up as a teen trying to climb up a mountain and failing, and then trying again and again and again. And when you do this sort of thing, you get very, very, very comfortable with failure. And I absolutely love that. And then I also think about team sports. I played football from 7th grade through 12th grade, and learning to work as a team and having a goal that was above the individual player. And there was something very educational about having that experience. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with either of these. They just came up and I felt like it was important to say. I'm not sure how that would translate into therapy, but there are times where I do recommend, and I'll ask kids if they're interested in joining some sort of team sport for the lessons that they can learn, or even martial arts, if they're willing to do it, with this idea of doing something hard and not being good at it and failing and persisting and having discomfort and learning the ability to be disciplined and get through it anyway. So I'm not sure, this is getting outside of metaphor, but I'm not sure how much you guys use sport itself as a therapeutic tool. Sorry, I'm taking like a left turn here, but.
Sorry, I'm still stuck on thinking about failure and mountain climbing and thinking about free solo, and that how maybe there is not a great return rate on failure in that type of climbing.
Not that way. Well, Jimmy was filming him, and he was on a rope and he was climbing. So yeah, so we don't want to quite have a metaphor. Don't climb ropes without ropes.
My palms are getting sweaty thinking about that.
Maybe there's a fine line between exposure and impulsivity that people might want to be mindful of.
Yeah.
Again, I was kind of listening to what you're saying and thinking about, maybe it's regardless of what you use, it calls into question to me, like, how do we define what failure is? Mm-hmm. Right? And is in sport, I started to think about, well, what about in music or in art, right? You put your heart and soul into producing a work of art, be it a song or a poem or a painting or a sculpture,
or a podcast.
Yeah. And you're going to put it out there, and including us in that process. And then you could be up there and you could see all these thumbs down and you suck, and what you, Jason, and you, everyone who was on this podcast sucks. And what are you talking about? And is that a failure, or it's up to us to decide what we're committing to here, and not getting up a particular cliff, or not getting a particular song hit number one, or not winning a championship, or not batting a 4 for 4 on a night is very select ways to measure that. And if you start to use that as your entry point with people, it can become very broad in terms of how we define terms that we use for ourselves, for example, and then you can iterate using almost any career or in any profession as to how we become very concrete in our mind about what a success is, even though that's just arbitrary, getting back to what Jess said about language and diffusing from terms that we use. So that was my reaction to what you were saying. I think all of what you said could be used very well with people as a metaphor for success or failure, for example.
That just got me thinking, and one of my patients actually brought this up recently because she went to Europe and went to an art museum about Vincent van Gogh, who I wrote a play about in 3rd grade. No big deal. But he didn't sell a single painting when he was alive. And yet now he is one of the most famous artists and everybody knows his name. And so I think that's another way, I mean, pop culture in general, right? That we can bring in these references and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, and I think now more than ever we see, I mean, if we're sticking with athletes or others, there's this intersection of them as athletes and them in real life. We just saw yesterday Simone Biles and Megan Rapinoe, getting the presidential medals, and that's meaningful, on multiple levels, right? So destigmatizing issues in mental health, promoting pay equity, and marginalized communities and their causes. And so I think, having the availability of whether, in this case, we're talking about athletes, Simone Biles withdrew from competition. Many people sort of vilified her for that. And when in fact, she was promoting mental health, the very thing that we're talking about. And here yesterday, she just got the youngest person, not only an athlete, but to get the Presidential Medal, of Freedom, or Megan Rapinoe, also vilified by the President of the United States, as it was, for, a host of things and speaking out. And then also, she and the team and many of the women in women's soccer promoting pay equity and sort of promoting causes. So I think now more than ever, there's so much crisscross that we see, certainly with social media, whether it's athletes or politicians or movie stars or other folks that can serve as, for better or worse, as we're saying, sort of some of these models that we can look to.
Yeah, I wanted to add something real quick. I'm sure we're getting short on time, but there was a pioneer in sports psychology named Ken Revisa, and he worked with tons of pro ball players and tons of great Division I NCAA players, and they would always tell him, after their time in baseball was up, that the stuff that he taught them helped them way more in their everyday life than it ever did in baseball, just helping them deal with family issues, with work stress, with, overcoming whatever obstacles come in their way. So this stuff can really help people, not just in their sport, but in their life. And I often work with athletes, but a lot of times I work with people who aren't necessarily athletes, but have a sport or some kind of activity that they enjoy. And maybe they have panic attacks, maybe they have OCD, maybe they feel overwhelmed and like they're never going to get better. But then, we can talk about, how they felt when they first started learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or how they felt when they first started learning their sport. And, and remember when, everything felt really hard and like you didn't know what you were doing, and people kept tapping you out, or you felt like you were never going to get better at this sport, but then you stuck it out, you kept practicing little by little, you gained more and more skill, and now you are where you are now. And we can think of ERP, or we could think of whatever type of treatment or whatever issue you're addressing in that same way. Right now it feels like this is impossible to handle. The skills that I'm learning, maybe it feels like they're not doing anything, but slow, consistent work over time will show those benefits. And in a couple months from now, and a couple more months in a year, you're going to feel much, much better if you keep on focusing on the process and keep putting the work in.
Okay. So before we wrap up today's wonderful episode, maybe I'll just go through every single person and what final thoughts you might have that we didn't cover today that you think is relevant to talk about metaphor. And I think one thing, if anybody wants to hit on that we didn't talk about is, well, we talked about why do it, but we didn't talk about how to do it. So if anybody has any thoughts on like, well, how do you actually do this in a therapy session for therapists, I think that would be kind of cool too. Jessica, you're number one on my screen, so I'm going to pick on you first again.
Sure. So if I can take a slightly different route than the how to do it, if I can make a pitch for one other place or one other series of places to use metaphor, we've been talking a lot about therapy specifically here, but it can also be used in other ways to disseminate information. So, I do a lot of media, like I mentioned earlier, Dr. Radio, talk to a lot of reporters, things like that. And I love using metaphors and pop culture in talking to all of these different people about mental health, because what's happening is it's such a large scale of dissemination of information about mental health that's reaching so many people, including many people that don't know much about mental health. And so you really want to make sure that you're sharing that information on a level that is as easily digestible as possible to the broadest scope of people. And what I think is really cool is when someone's reading a magazine article or something like that, or seeing, a psychologist on New York One or NBC or whatever it might be, is they want it snappy, they want it quick, they want it digestible, and to be able to hook people into the knowledge of what CBT and other types of psychotherapies can be really powerful. And I think that's where metaphors and pop culture can be extra, useful, because you can get a lot of information in a short span of time and really whet people's palate to this concept of how to engage with mental health in a way that doesn't feel so scary. And so if there's anyone out there who is a therapist, a mental health provider, or just a healthcare professional in general who's looking for a way to disseminate information, sharing this kind of information in the press world can be a super cool way to do it.
Okay. Next on my screen is Sandra.
Yeah, I'll speak a little to the how and a little to the why, I guess. So I think the how is related to what we were talking about before. I think part of it is doing what we naturally love as people, as the people we are, in addition to the therapists, whether it's TV shows or sports or whatever we tend to get drawn to. And then there's the intentional, right? So if I see a teenager walking in and they're wearing a shirt of a certain performer or anime or something, they're giving us information about them, and it's all usable in terms of it be behavioral observation of what we can use. And so sometimes that will align with some of the things that I already know, and other times I'll seek it out if I'm looking to connect or ask about it or think about ways to include it. And so I think thinking sort of with intention sometimes about how we can bring it in. Certainly, in working with kids and teenagers, kind of like I said before. The other, and I guess it's related, the why is like people like Lizzo and Beyonce are amazing. They are a wealth of resources that have one, I think, I use Beyonce and stuff. We have a Beyonce scale, and it's a confidence rating for teenagers brought up by a teen that was in my social anxiety group, and she wanted to increase her Beyonce confidence ratings. I'm like, okay, me too. Like, let's do it. And so that was on a scale of 0 to Beyonce. How confident do you feel, right? And so, like, that's a way of communicating. Like I think Kristen, you said before, a common language, right? Of making us relatable, and I think in really good ways if we find the right people. I'll close with this. I'm a reluctant Twitter user, for the record. And I saw a tweet from Cardi B, and Cardi B tweeted, "Anxiety is kicking my ass right now." Like, if Cardi B is talking openly about her anxiety, that's a win, right? And that's exactly what we want. Cardi B, for all that, she is and that she does. The other thing, there were these replies, and someone said, well, that's what weed is for. And then she replied and said, no, that makes me more anxious. So now if old psychology ladies say that, I'm like, boring, right? But if Cardi B gives that psychoeducation and says, well, you might want to be careful with that because, the weed might make you more anxious, it's incredibly powerful. So I think if we find these different either messengers or stories, I think that's the why. I think they can be incredibly powerful messengers for the stuff that we're trying to convey.
Okay, Jason, final thoughts?
Let's see. Well, as far as the how, a lot of times I just kind of draw from them, and it can be a great way to build rapport. I've had clients who maybe they're an adolescent and maybe they're not excited about opening up, but then I can ask them about gaming. I can ask them about their favorite YouTubers, or now it might be TikTokers, and they usually have someone that they admire, and then I just start asking them questions about them, or if the client's into anime or gaming or League of Legends, I start asking, how do you get good at that? How do you uh, perform well as a team with your friends? Because a lot of it is online gaming together with a group, and then they can get excited about it and start talking about something that they feel really passionate about. And it can also be a way to kind of cool down after an especially intense exposure. When somebody's at a 10 out of 10 and feeling really, jittery, I can just ask them, hey, do you have any good movies you're going to watch this weekend? And then we can just start talking about that for a second. And maybe that segues into a great metaphor, maybe not, but it can help people really cool down when they're feeling on edge. Yeah, and I'll just say that the last thing, maybe this gets into the why. For me, it's a lot of fun. It's so much fun. I like watching movies. I like talking about movies. I get to bring that enjoyment into the session, and clients most of the time will really enjoy it. So that's just something else to think about. It's fun.
Bob Leahy, who's a bit of a mentor to me, always talks about when he said this in the context of couples counseling, that oftentimes people have the skills in other parts of their lives, and then they just need to remember to translate it over. Like, how would you handle this disagreement if it was with your boss? Okay, well, can we do that instead of yelling at your husband, wife, or something like that? How can you do it like that and translate it over? And I think that's very much what you were saying, is that sometimes people are already doing these great things in their life and have these great behaviors and skills, and they just don't realize how it connects and how they can pull it over there. So I think that's very cool. Chris, my first question to you is, how do we get to watch this Van Gogh play that you made? Is it on YouTube? Can you reenact it for us?
It is definitely on video in my parents' basement somewhere.
I'm calling them up.
Yeah, we'll have to get them to put it on YouTube someday. I watched it. I rewatched it, and I was like, oh man, that was just a bunch of kids saying facts about Van Gogh. So it wasn't the most moving or riveting piece. But I will say, in my kind of final thoughts here, in the how, just piggybacking on what Jason was saying, I think in my assessments, I know we talk a lot about, what's going wrong when we're doing an assessment with a new patient, but I like to always end it with, what's going right. So what are their strengths, and also what are their interests and things they like to do? And I think it's sometimes jarring for patients to be like, oh, why are you asking me about these things? But it's also kind of a way to start that type of conversation and start to bank some ideas of things that might be useful kind of moving into the therapy space. And I think, speaking of things being on YouTube, bringing it alive in the therapy session. I love to play YouTube videos with my patients. And most of these things you can find in a nice little clip on YouTube if you look for it. So I think that's a great way to just watch together and then to start a conversation without me having to be the one to bring it up. And I think also saying what I think a lot of us have been saying, it's just fun. And don't be afraid to have fun in therapy. I think, we sometimes think, this has to be a very serious matter. But being fun then attaches a different type of emotion to the content that we're talking about, a different meaning. And then also sometimes, I think many of my patients have said this to me, then they have conversations about it with their family, with their friends. Guess what I learned in therapy today? And what's good about that? Repetition. Now they're going to remember it more because they're talking about it. So it doesn't have to be stuffy. It can be fun too.
Mm-hmm. What's more powerful than fun and effective? I don't know. I think that's as good as it gets. So Simon, I'm very happy that I got randomly sat next to you a few years ago at a table. I think it was at the Beck Summit. Number one, because I got to know you throughout the years, but also you have introduced me to this very impressive and knowledgeable panel, and I'm very thankful for all of you guys coming on today. So Simon, what are the last thoughts that you have for this episode?
Well, first I'll just say thank you. It was a real treat, and I appreciate so much meeting you at the Excellent Summit years ago as well. And I'm so glad and so proud of what you're doing with your podcast. I looked at your lineup, and you've had some amazing topics and speakers come on since you launched it. And so kudos to you for putting this material out there. And people should check out your entire library of podcasts, because there's some really, Bob Leahy being the last one prior to us, but there's a whole host of people that are doing some really interesting and important work in our field. So kudos to you for that. And
I appreciate that.
I'll be very pragmatic about the how. There's a literature on the how. And I think Kristen and I joined on it because her mentor at BU wrote a paper in 2000 on Michael Otto wrote a paper in 2000, Cognitive and Behavioral Practice, on using metaphors in CBT, which was taken from his protocol on CBT for benzodiazepine or tapering, right, for panic, yes. I think. And that was the first paper that I thought really summarized it so well, with examples that you can use at different points in therapy. And since then, 22 years ago, there's been a whole host of papers published on different applications of CBT, metaphors in CBT and other forms of therapy. Our friends in the ACBS world, the Association for Contextual Behavior Science, published the big book of ACT metaphors you can buy, and that'll start you off with a whole bunch. And there's a group out of Oxford that has the use of metaphors in CBT that they published. And then there's another similar book on stories and analogies in CBT, and they're loaded with examples and rationale and theory and a bit of the empirical evidence behind them. So if people are struggling with how to start, you don't have to go quite so far and take a chance on your own. You can read a little bit about it and figure out which ones to start with, and from traditional metaphors that are used to explain the cognitive model or other aspects to using pop culture metaphors or superheroes in therapy. So there's a whole literature out there that people could turn to, and the whys. I think I started with that, and it really is a challenge and an exciting way of bringing the art to the science of how do you take a concept and make it memorable to a patient and have them come back, as Kristen alluded to, and say, I remember this, and this made me laugh, or this surprised me, or Pimentel was quoting Cardi B again, or and I think that's those are the memories that I remember as a trainee. I just did a little video snippet for Jack Rackman, who passed away in the past year, who was a real legend in the field. And at the 50th annual British Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapies conference, they're going to show a video montage of people commenting on the impact he had. And the snippet that I used for myself was remembering him bringing humor into the sessions with the OCD patients that he invited me to do co-therapy and watch him. And really severe OCD patients, he found a way to weave humor into the exposures. And I was shocked as a graduate student, saying, you can do that? And in fact, I think you needed that to break the frame of the anxiety and the grip that fear had on people, and then people could do the work that was necessary. So that's the why. It allows you to be a little bit more free while still adhering to principles that I think are so important in the evidence-based treatments that we use.
Yeah. And we have quite a few grad students that listen to this podcast, and I think that's a really good moral for people to take off starting off, because I know when I first got started, I was as stiff as a board. So, it's definitely a valuable point. So before we sign out, I should have had you guys do this when you guys were saying your last points, but if anybody wants to follow you on Twitter, Instagram, if there's a web page, I'm just going to go through just so you could tell people that, and then we will sign off today. So Jessica, how can people follow you and learn about what you're doing?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram, and my handle at both is at Dr. Jessica B as in boy, Stern. And you can also find me on my website, drjessicabstern.com, or on the NYU Lingo and Health website.
Okay. Sandra, over to you.
Twitter is probably the best way to find me, at Sandra Pym, PhD. That's on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn, which is less fun, but I'm there too. And if not, you can catch me at Yankee Stadium until hopefully October and through October.
Okay. Jason?
You can find my group practice on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, at CBT SoCal. And then you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at CBT Sports Psych. And I'm also on LinkedIn. And I will be starting my own podcast in the fall called Movie House Sports Psychology. And I'll be doing the same kind of thing, talking about movies through the lens of mental health and sports psychology. So I'm excited about that.
Wow, very cool.
And you're all welcome to join.
Well, when that gets up and running, just let me know, because I've show notes and I'm going to be linking all of your Twitter handles and everything, so people afterwards can look and just click if they're interested. So once that's up and running, let me know, and that link will be added to the show note.
Yeah, and then actually I do have a trailer up. So I don't have episodes recorded and posted, but the trailer is up. So I can send you a link, and if anybody wants to right now, they can subscribe so that they'll get episodes when it comes
out. Kristen.
As much as Simon has been trying to convince me to be on all the social media platforms and get my own website, I still have not done it yet. So you can really only find me at NYU Langone's website. Last name is Szuhany, which is Szuhany. And maybe someday I will have my own social media too.
Okay, well, if you ever do it, let me know. I'll throw it in the notes. And Simon?
I think I'm going to make a Kristen Szuhany website myself. I'm going to take her name and take the domain and just start posting pictures on her behalf. So.
That's fine by me. I'll source it out.
You can find me on KristenSuhany.com. The easiest way is just my name, and if you'll have our names up, if you Google Simon Rego and add.com, that has all my social media icons and other goodies of what conferences and anything we're writing or working on here. So that's the most straightforward way nowadays.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, thank every single one of you for taking time out of your Friday evening to be with us on the podcast. And I think people have learned a tremendous amount today. So thank you for coming on.